Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're really going to dig into something that sounds simple on the surface but gets complicated quickly. Sustainable development, especially where it intersects with ecotourism.
Yeah, and it feels like sustainable development is such a buzzword these days that it's almost losing its meaning.
Totally, but there's that classic definition, right? Meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs.
Absolutely. That comes from the Brundtland Report, 1987, a real landmark report.
But then it's like, whose needs are we talking about?
Exactly. That's where things get tricky, because the needs of someone in rural India, for example, are likely very different from the needs of someone in a high-income country.
Right, it's like that whole debate around carbon emissions. Developing countries often argue that they need to use fossil fuels to grow their economies, while developed nations, who have historically been the biggest emitters, push for everyone to cut back.
Yeah, and that raises tough questions about fairness and equity. How do you tell a country trying to improve its standard of living that they can't use the same resources that wealthier nations used to get where they are?
It's a tough one. And then you have the three pillars of sustainable development: first, economic growth; second, environmental protection; and third, social equity. It sounds straightforward, but
even those pillars can be interpreted in very different ways depending on who you ask. An industrialist might see economic growth through a completely different lens than an environmental activist.
right, and NGOs might focus more on ensuring the benefits of development reach marginalized communities. So it's not just about balancing the three pillars, it's about figuring out whose interpretation takes priority.
And as if that wasn't complex enough, there's also the concept of just sustainability.
Okay, unpack that for me. What does just sustainability mean?
Imagine trying to achieve sustainable development in a community that relies heavily on natural resources, like a rainforest. A traditional approach might focus on conservation efforts and perhaps some ecotourism to generate income.
Makes sense.
But just sustainability pushes us to ask, who owns the land? Who profits from the ecotourism? Are indigenous communities benefiting, or are they being displaced? Are their voices being heard in decision-making?
So it's about making sure no one gets left behind in the name of progress, whether that progress is environmental or economic.
Precisely, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about who benefits from traditional development models and who bears the brunt of the costs.
Which makes you wonder, can we even talk about sustainability without addressing the growth dilemma?
That's the burning question, right? We live on a planet with finite resources, but our economic systems often depend on the idea of infinite growth.
Exactly, it's like we're on a collision course and nobody's sure how or even if we should hit the brakes. There's that whole limits to growth argument.
Absolutely, the Club of Rome warned about the consequences of unchecked growth on a finite planet back in the 1970s.
While their predictions haven't exactly come true on their timeline, they sparked a vital conversation about carrying capacity and whether endless growth is even possible or desirable in the long run.
And it raised valid concerns, especially from developing countries, who felt like they were being told to limit their growth to solve a problem they didn't create.
Right, it highlights the tension between ecological limits and the very real desire for a better quality of life.
That's the question we're still grappling with today. And when you look at how businesses are tackling these big issues, it gets even more interesting. Many companies now brand themselves as sustainable or eco-friendly.
Right, like every other commercial these days is about going green or reducing their carbon footprint.
It makes you wonder, how much of it is genuine concern for the planet and how much is just clever marketing?
Yeah, it seems like some companies are cashing in on the conscious consumer trend.
It's probably a bit of both. Some companies realize that sustainability isn't just a moral imperative, it can also be good for business.
I can see that. Investing in renewable energy could save money in the long run.
Exactly. And sourcing materials sustainably can attract environmentally conscious consumers.
So it's not just about doing the right thing. It's about staying competitive in a market that increasingly demands ethical practices.
Right, but the challenge is knowing whether these actions are making a real difference or if they're just, well, greenwashing.
Yeah, it's easy to sound good with fancy slogans and green packaging, but how do we know companies are actually walking the talk?
That's the challenge. Initiatives like the series principles are trying to address this. Have you heard of them?
Vaguely, remind me?
They're voluntary guidelines for businesses to demonstrate their commitment to sustainability.
So instead of just saying, hey, we're sustainable, these companies are setting specific goals.
Exactly. Things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, conserving water, and promoting environmental justice within their operations and supply chains.
That sounds promising, but voluntary guidelines makes it sound like there's not much enforcement.
That's the big criticism. Without strong regulations and independent oversight, it's hard to ensure transparency and accountability.
It's like, who's watching the watchers?
Exactly.
So we need a global effort to tackle these global problems, which brings us to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs.
17 goals, ambitious to say the least.
Almost overwhelming when you think about it. Ending poverty, tackling climate change, reducing inequality. They're going after everything.
It's a tall order.
Do you think it's achievable, realistically?
That's the question. Like any worthwhile goal, it comes with challenges. Securing resources and funding, especially in developing countries that face the greatest barriers.
Right, and that ties back to equity. It's not just about setting ambitious goals, it's about making sure everyone has the resources to achieve them.
Absolutely. And then there's the even bigger philosophical question. What is our moral obligation to future generations, and how do we balance the needs of the present with the sustainability of the future?
So we've talked about global challenges. Let's zoom in on ecotourism. It gets a lot of buzz as a sustainable way to travel, but
It's not as simple as it sounds.
right, how do you balance the desire to experience amazing natural places with the need to protect them?
Ecotourism tries to be more sustainable than traditional tourism, emphasizing conservation, local community involvement, and minimizing negative impacts on the environment and culture.
The key word being tries. With more people able to travel, even well-intentioned destinations face pressure.
You're right, Belize is a great example. Rainforests, the Belize Barrier Reef, and Mayan ruins make it a top ecotourism destination.
It's like a trifecta of ecotourism hotspots.
Exactly, and tourism there has exploded. In the 1960s, Belize saw around 11,000 visitors a year. By 2015, it was over 1 million.
Wow, so tourism is a huge part of Belize's economy now.
Huge, around 28% of GDP and a significant portion of employment.
So there's the upside, economic opportunities and potential conservation funding, but what's the downside?
The Belize Barrier Reef is incredibly vulnerable to human impact. More boats and divers, even careful ones, can damage coral.
And then there's waste management. Places like this can't always handle the increased tourism, leading to pollution.
Exactly. And socially, are local communities benefiting or being displaced? Are their traditions being commodified?
Important questions. So, how do we make ecotourism genuinely sustainable?
It's not a pipe dream, but it requires a mindful approach. We need to rethink unlimited tourism growth.
So maybe limiting visitors and charging higher fees?
Exactly. Without protection, these places won't be around for future generations.
How do we ensure ecotourism profits benefit local communities?
Community-based tourism is key. Instead of big corporations controlling tourism, local communities should manage their own ventures.
Asserting their right to control resources and ensure they see economic benefits.
Exactly. Educating tourists is vital, but respecting local customs and supporting local businesses is also essential.
It's about fostering responsibility. Tourists must understand their impact on the places they visit and the people who live there.
Ultimately, sustainable development, whether in ecotourism or other industries, comes down to recognizing our interconnectedness. The choices we make have ripple effects. If we want a future where everyone can thrive, we need to make those choices consciously, equitably, and with respect for the planet and each other.
I love that. A fantastic note to end on. A huge thank you to our expert for this insightful deep dive. And to our listeners, we hope this conversation sparks new ideas, critical thinking, and maybe a little hope for a more sustainable future. Until next time, keep exploring, questioning, and diving deep. Until we meet again, take care and stay connected.